Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests, Amjad Masad of Repl.it and Christina Cacioppo of Vanta. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Amjad, why don't we start with you? What is Repl.it?
Repl.it is, at its heart, an interactive programming environment. But we kind of take that to its ultimate conclusion. Not only can you test code, but you can actually write full production applications in this interactive environment. You start very easily. You can start with Hello World or what have you. You can start in basically 2 seconds, but you can go as deep as you want in terms of creating and building stuff.
Yeah. And Christina, you angel invested in Repl.it.
Yep.
I believe you passed it to me and I foolishly didn't pursue it because I was outside of my expertise. Is that the story that you were told?
Mostly. So I had the advantage of having met Amjad probably 4 years prior to that. And so I'd seen kind of a open source side project or evolve into a fully fledged website that had thousands or tens of thousands of users at that point. And so I kind of watched it change over that point. But it was very much kind of an in-browser IDE and programming environment and infrastructure. And so you could just start writing code and running it in a web browser.
And Amjad was at Code Academy prior, so obviously been interested in coding education. And you too, Christina, when you were at USV, I think you wrote a bit about coding education. What sort of informed your thesis or interest there?
I came at it very personally in that I don't have an academic CS background, but actually at some point when I was at USV and Venture, decided that, in many ways Venture is great, but I really wanted to go build things on the internet and make things. And in order to do that, I had to go learn to code. So I spent time doing that to some degree, and I think because I came at it later, people would make fun of me for saying later in life, but I felt like at 24, I was really old doing it, that so much of learning to program was kind of, there was this mystique around it. It's very hard. You have to be a math genius. And so much what I found the hard parts were just setting up your computer to do things and then figuring out what it was doing. And those were all things that Amjad and Repl.it had abstracted away. So it was super compelling because it was this place where you could just go start trying to code and you didn't have to deal with any of the set up your laptop stuff that is tedious and menial and necessary. And I think, at least for me, made me as a beginner feel like an idiot because I couldn't get it working.
Right. And when did you know that this was the idea that you were going to pursue relative to any other idea that you could pursue?
Very late, actually. So initially, I didn't think, still skeptical that you can build a business on top of a REPL. So REPL is an online programming environment, read, eval, print loop. It's been invented by the Lisp people in the 50s or 60s as a radical way to program computers. Because back then, you would you'd do punch cards, or you would write large amounts of C program or whatever language at the time they were using, and then you would get a little bit of computer time, and then you compile your code, and then something comes out of the other end, maybe a few minutes later, and then your computer time is up, and then that's it. Computer time was really valuable. What the Lisp folks did, they inverted the question. They said that actually eventually computer time will not be as valuable as human time. And so REPLs are essentially about kind of valuing human time more than computer time. So this is where the sort of interactive programming experience started. And actually the shift has not been fully done yet. We still, in some sense, there's still this artifact coming from the era where computer time was more valuable than human time, where we write code in a way that we appease the machine more than we appease the human. And that is reflected in our tools and our everything that we do. When I was studying computer science and then found that, all the problems that Christina talked about where, I'd have to set up my environment and all of that stuff, I started thinking everything should be a REPL. And then I should put a REPL in the browser and I should just start coding immediately. And then, I open sourced that stuff and bunch of, I grew up in Jordan, so that was where I started it. And then a bunch of US and Silicon Valley companies started using our open source projects. most famously Code Academy, and I joined Code Academy as the first employee, and then started kind of working on this stuff. But, after I left and then worked at Facebook for a while, also in developer tools, I didn't think that we'd be able to start a company on this concept. When Christina and I connected, we connected over actually what's called end user computing. So I think after Christina kind of traversed this maze of like learning to code, the idea was that maybe not everyone should learn to code. Maybe we should build systems that allow people to compute without learning how to code. And this is how we started kind of talking to each other and potentially like wanted to start a company in this space. And at the time, like nobody was really doing stuff in this space. Now we have more people, I think, Airtable most famously kind of is now doing end user computing stuff. For the last, 50 years, it's been just spreadsheets. This is how we did end user computing. And so the question is like, how do we bring that back? In a sense, there was a regression in end user computing, because if you look at the past, you had things like Apple's, HyperCard and HyperTalk, where it was like very, very simple English-like syntax, and you can you can code cards together, you can do different things together. But, and there was like a lot of experiments in the past, but nothing really stuck. The end user of the computer became sort of the very passive consumer, and like everything is abstracted away. When a kid gets an iPhone, that's like, there's no way for them to understand how to like program this thing. If they want to program this thing, they have to buy a $3,000 laptop. Then on top of that, pay Apple $100 to be able to program it. So, all these ideas were kind of floating in the air around the time. We didn't know what exactly we wanted to do. The reason we ended up, so like my partner and my wife and my co-founder, Haya, she's our designer. By the time we started the company, the reason we started it is because like really it became such a sort of a maintenance burden, because we're paying so much money and we're spending so much time on it, and there's like so much pull from our users, and we're like, okay, maybe this could be a business, and this is how it started. And Christina was the first check in the company. Yeah, and
the first, or that was a very easy yes in lots of ways, but one of the kind of great things is having known Amjad and like these open source projects being things he'd worked on, and at various points, maybe from the outside, it seeming like I wasn't convinced you actually wanted to work on it, but it like kept growing and kept getting pulled back. And so there was this bit of kind of inevitability of like the trajectory of it, right? Like this thing is going to keep going. And Amjad is like so strong at both what kind of product, like what should be built here, and then technically like can go build anything. And so it's like that sort of inevitability, and then the like just growth of the open source tools. You're like, oh yeah, write those checks all day long.
Totally. And you yourself went out a couple years ago and started to start a company called Vanta. Yes. So why don't you talk about what Vanta is and how you pursued that idea?
Yeah, so Vanta's a little different, still a bit infrastructure and developer focused. So Vanta, at its highest level, automates security and compliance. So we're building a suite of security tools for internet businesses. And the idea is basically twofold. One, if you use these, your business will actually be more secure. So you'll be less likely to get hacked, to lose user data, all of that. But then two, if you're using our tools, we can go through compliance audits and get compliance certifications on your behalf. So again, so the pitch, and, when I think about like the users who are using and paying for Vanta today, roughly half of them use it for what we call kind of sleeping better at night and like better peace of mind and better security. And then half use it because we can get them a SOC 2, it's a specific standard, but we can get them this report that's like extraordinarily valuable to their business that they can send to their customers or prospects to say like, hey, we had a third party come in, better security. It's reasonable. You can kind of trust us with your customer data. The short version of kind of the story of Vanta is my co-founder and I kind of wanted to start a security company, but spent a lot of time thinking about the security market and why in some ways there's so many security companies. And in some ways, no one seems to use any of them, right? Or it's just like, how do you differentiate? And the thing we realized and very much believe, kind of the dawning moment was security and compliance have traditionally been pretty separate things. And so, if you talk to especially engineers about it, they'll be like, oh, look, I do some security. I would like to do security. Compliance is this like check the box exercise that's totally divorced from anything that the business makes me do. And if you talk to engineers who've gone through compliance work, they will often like not even sit down and talk to you and like run screaming from the room and be like, I never want to think about this again. And the thing we realized is compliance in its kind of purest form or best form is actually how you prove your security. And so these things actually should be coupled, and they should be coupled quite closely. Of like, it is very valuable to be able to prove and have like an objective third party come in and say, hey, I checked and like your settings are good. And like, you have set up AWS in a reasonable way, and you will not be on, the latest TechCrunch brief or breach for being a doofus. And that's like a very valuable service for the world. And so that's kind of when we sort of realized like, compliance again in its best form, it's how you prove this thing. And when you prove this, you can grow your business and get more sales, and like people love that part of it. So you should actually kind of bring these two things together, and that's what Vanta does.
Because you were at USV and because you were an active angel, you saw a lot of different spaces, companies in across different categories. How did you sort of identify this as the category where you wanted to build a business relative to?
Yeah, we started out with kind of like a very high level brainstorm and tried to be open to many things. But I think fundamentally the things that ended up being important to us was something that had kind of growth in it. And I don't mean like startup hockey stick. I mean something that would help people or businesses grow or like produce economic growth, which again, kind of compliance does. It kind of helps people grow their business. And then if you have automatically verified compliance, you're hopefully actually secure underneath it. And then something where we knew we could go sit down with and kind of be on a first name with our initial users was really important. Yeah. And that's kind of much more personal preference of this. Yeah. Like that's how I've successfully built things in the past. And when I haven't done that, I've unsuccessfully built things. And so I kind of don't know how to build products without doing that.
I think tools also, like, cause watching the evolution of you and Erik's ideas was a lot of it is about tools.
That is true. Yeah. And so there's this kind of leverage of like, how do you get, or you can think of leverage or like superpowers, but like who kind of are you giving superpowers to? And in Vanta's case, it's often an engineer, kind of a lead engineer who often actually wants to work on security, can't prioritize it because the business needs other things. And then historically would like have to do this compliance exercise. And so we can kind of let them like go through that process much more easily and then also get to focus on the security work they want to focus on.
Yeah. Amjad, we were talking earlier how the DevTools category has been either misunderstood or underrated or underestimated by the VC community. Talk a little bit about that.
Just before that, just interesting anecdote. Christina and us, like Vanta and us, we ended up in the same YC batch.
Oh, really?
So it's interesting.
That's great.
Not only the same YC batch, the same group in YC. So it was a lot of fun doing that. In terms of DevTools, like there's a lot of different ways to slice up DevTools. Definitely some section of DevTools have done well, and that's infrastructure. Infrastructure has done well. But in terms of programming environments, that hasn't been a focus. And that's something that's been traditionally really hard to raise money for. If I like think really hard, I can only like remember one or two startups that have done DevTools and got significant funding. And that's one of them is Xamarin, for example, by Nat Friedman, who ended up being acquired by Microsoft and then ended up leading the acquisition of GitHub, and now he's the CEO of GitHub. And maybe you could argue that GitHub is also like in that category, and GitHub had to bootstrap, and then eventually when Andreessen kind of put in the $100 million, everyone in the industry said that was stupid, that they overpaid for it, and all of that stuff. Now, of course, like it happens a lot, Andreessen ends up being right in the end, and now there is like a big resurgence in developer tools, and now there's a lot of interest just because of the GitHub exit. So, I mean, you can't blame them that there hasn't been really a lot of big exits. IDEs and programming environments haven't been profitable for anyone for years and years. Maybe there are like one or two IDE companies that are like good businesses, but are not like really venture-backed businesses. And so that's been part of the problem. But it's actually like a bigger paradox than that. Like, if you really think about it, like our tools really suck. Like engineers are one of the highest, being a software engineer is one of the highest leveraged thing you can do, right? You can have a lot of impact in the world. You can create economic growth. You can build amazing things. You can touch a lot of lives. Yet we don't, as a society, not just Silicon Valley, we don't really invest in developer tools that much, right? So when I was at Facebook, I created a group to build developer tools, and we only survived 8 months, and under constant pressure to basically like, what are you doing for the company? We're like making developers more efficient, and like, well, there's a problem there of the measurement problem. Like, this has been talked about since the Mythical Man month and in the 70s, and before that, it was like, how do you measure developer productivity? There's the lines of code measure, which turned out to be crap, right? But it's still, there's a big measurement problem, right? So they ended up shutting down my group. We achieved a lot, but at the end of the day, we just couldn't keep defending our group that this is really important. Most companies would take in a new engineer, and they'd have to decide, okay, should that engineer go build tools for other engineers, or should we put them on another product group? And usually the incentive is put them on another product group, let them build more product. Yet, if you think about it rationally, if they are able to make engineers, like, I know everyone in the company, like 5%, about 1% more productive, it's such a, so why do they always make the decision to not build developer tools, right? Of course, there are some instances where companies do, but it's really still underinvested. So that's kind of a paradox that I've been thinking about. And our programming tools are still so primitive. Like the kind of stuff that we build at Repl.it, and we think they're huge innovations. I'm always, after we release it and everyone is excited and we're excited. And I really think about it. It's like, this should have existed years ago, right?
Or like somebody prototyped it in the 70s.
Yeah.
Right? And like in some ways the ideas aren't new, but the diffusion of them just hasn't happened. And that is, I think, a substantial innovation. But I very much remember when I was starting to program, or like I kind of still believe this. My theory was just that not everyone, but most engineers have started programming when they're young. And so they just like use the things in front of them and then they get used to them. And basically everyone has Stockholm syndrome and just doesn't realize how bad the tools are because they've used them for 15 years and are like, look, when I get a new laptop, I'm going to spend 4 hours setting it up because that's what you do. And when you're a new person, you're like, okay, your 4 hours is my 24. And I'm going to be crying in hour 5 because I just can't get it, right? And I'm going to be crying out of frustration. And so software engineering is in some ways, or to broadly generalize, it has this weird attribute of it's full of people who believe in leverage and changing the world and they can do all these things. And then they put up with just such bad tools for themselves.
Yeah.
So bad.
Zooming out, Christina, if you put your USV hat on or your Angel hat on, how do you sort of slice up the dev tools space in terms of like what are different subsectors that are potentially investable or that they're, companies that can potentially be big?
Yeah, well, I think I kind of do subscribe to I can't remember who it was. Andreessen, maybe someone with everything is either Jim Clark. Everything is either bundled or rebundled or unbundled or rebundled depending on your era. And so I think right now we're in this sort of era where things like Amjad and to some extent, a Notion or an Airtable are taking a bunch of what used to be separate companies. So like here we have an editor and we have a, backend as a service, like an AWS Heroku thing. And maybe we have a collaboration tool like GitHub, right? And like sort of bundling these all into one more cohesive experience. So I think there's like a group of companies there, and I think we'll kind of see more of them. I think there's also a lot of companies in the like, how do you get code or something from your laptop up to the internet? And I mean, like Repl.it is one of these. We talked a little bit about Glitch beforehand, Heroku, AWS, and Grok to some extent is this. There's kind of companies there where I think it's, again, I made a thing on my laptop. I want to show it to people. How do I do that quickly? What else? Lots of developer workflow tools. So how do I write tests faster or run tests faster or get and deploy code faster? Like CI/CD stuff. What else?
Pass, I guess. Well, you can think of us, Heroku, Pass. There's container as service.
Yeah.
DigitalOcean just released one. There's serverless is another category that's growing. Serverless is like more hype than usage right now, but that's the hype model. It's maybe people will sour on serverless next year and then the real work starts. But right now it's like, it's obvious when you look at serverless that the other day I was listening to a podcast and Guillermo Rauch of Zeit is another one of those serverless companies. And what he said is like, serverless is to the cloud what VMs are to hardware. So now what's happening is we're treating the cloud as the hardware layer. And I had a tweet that said that every computing platform, the hardware starts out to be the most valuable thing, but within time it shifts to the software. And the PC has been the case, when IBM first came out with their PC and Bill Gates, pushed them on DOS. And then he said, like, I want to maintain the rights to like actually license it to others. And I'm like, who cares? Like the hardware is where it's at, right? Where it ends up, Microsoft being the most valuable company in the world. And so that's a really interesting trend in DevTools as well.
I was going to say end user computing things. So this is, I think, as these tools get easier and easier to use, and serverless is a good example of, I think in some ways it's great for beginners because you have to learn fewer things to start or to get something up and running. And so just as it becomes easier and easier to start playing with code or messing with code or writing code, you'll see more and more people doing it.
Yep. What are examples of unicorns or mega companies that have emerged in the last decade or so of dev? I mean, Docker. I mean, what are examples?
Yeah, I think most of
Mongo.
databases.
There's a whole set of database companies.
Yeah, they will always come up. Database companies. I think Docker. I think infrastructure companies have been like the most successful in the space.
I mean, Heroku, which is like required by Salesforce for a decent amount of money, but then just like the growth since then within Salesforce, like they are quite large today and growing quickly.
There's also like Ansible, Mesosphere. All these folks like. Infrastructure is.
GitHub's a good one that's top of mind for everyone.
Right.
Microsoft, right, itself has become, they have, one of the top programming languages and one of the top IDEs, and they're both open source, and it's weird for those people who remember old Microsoft.
GitLab is another one.
Yeah.
GitLab's really interesting because GitLab, I think, figured out the strategy of, rebundling, like we talked about, where everyone criticizes GitLab for building too much. And hey, the quality's not there or whatever. But eventually the quality will get there and a lot of the stuff that they build, eventually will fit into a cohesive story. And actually Repl.it is like that as well. What we do is you don't need to learn anything. You only need to focus on code first, right? You just go into the environment, spin up the language that you prefer and start coding. If you open a server, if you open a port in the environment, we detect that and we show you your web output and we actually host the container for you. If you start doing some graphics, we'll show that for you. You don't need to learn version control. We have this auto versioning scheme that we need to do. We think eventually people learning in our platform, people using our platform, eventually they'll start expanding their horizon and learning all this other stuff. But for the most part, we want to be able to control the entire experience end to end. And not because we're greedy and want to do everything. It's because that's the best way to do developer experience. When I was fundraising for Repl.it, I had this scary slide that shows you all the different things that you need to know to build an app, right? Everything from version control to, hosting, repositories like GitHub to something like Vagrant, something like Docker, databases, of course, editors. And it's just a huge map of thing. And so for us to take all that stuff and simplify, and find something that is just the absolute simplest thing you can use to get started. And it remains to be seen whether we can actually capture the entire end-to-end experience, but we're actually going after that. And we're trying to build the entire thing out.
How much do you guys think about what people are building on Repl.it or trying to nudge them in various directions, if at all?
They nudge us most of the time. Our ambition has been driven by our users. The more we see our users create stuff, the more ambitious we are. When we did the web server stuff, we we'd get error reports. Someone would say like, I opened a server on your platform and it's not serving my requests. Like that's because it can't do that. And then the first time you ignore it, the second time you ignore it, the 10th time it's like, all right, there's like actual demand here for that. And we start doing that. And then you start seeing people building apps and games and things that they want to host and things they want to share. And then, all right, I guess we can do some hosting. We had our feedback forum. And our feedback forum was just people giving us feedback and bugs and things like that. And then we saw people creating communities on our feedback forum. Like they'll report a bug and then they'll start talking and then they'll start sharing their programs. And we're like, all right, I guess we need to build a community. And it's been very much, that pull from our users. There's some cases where we're nudging them to either use a more recent technology, but for the most part, we're not that opinionated. I think predicting the future when it comes to developer tools is extremely hard. And, there are a lot of companies that will say, oh, this language is the future or this tool is the future. We don't do that. I think it's practically impossible to do that. And so I think we always think that there's going to be a plurality of languages and tools. So we want to be able to be as open, as inclusive, as diverse in terms of the tools as possible.
Yeah, one of the parts of it that I think is really neat is historically, it seems like investors and like practitioners have taken tools or products like Repl.it where you're like, look, we're going to abstract away most things and you won't need to know a version control system and you won't need to know really servers or this, that, and the other. And been like, oh, that's cute. People can make toys, right? And in the derisive sense, not in the like Chris Dixon, you're inventing the future sense. And it's been neat to kind of watch the Repl.it community make more real things and more toyish things, right? But just make so much stuff that it feels, like the snowball is rolling down the hill and it is, quite large, and just like the increasing sense of inevitability of people will make very real things on a platform like Repl.it, hopefully actually Repl.it. Whereas it feels like even, 4, 5, 6 years ago, this was, oh, you can make cute toys, or, oh, you could learn things, and it's like, beginners, but then they're going to jump off to real development at some point.
Yeah, maybe that's part of the paradox that we were talking about. Part of why is it that our tool is so primitive? Maybe because there's a bottleneck where you attempt to build this like more advanced thing, and the kind of people that you attract are the kids and the hobbyists. And then most companies will get dismayed by that, right? It's like, I don't want all these hobbyists. I was actually talking to like one real successful company, and they were so mad that what they built was appealing to hobbyists. And they wanted professional developers, right? But if you look at the history of computing, it's like mostly been hobbyists that's driven computing. Like the Mac was a hobbyist machine.
Club, yeah.
Right? And then before, what was it? The VisiCalc? Like there was no real professional
like accountant or bookkeeping software,
for the Mac. And the Mac has been mostly games, education, things like that. So I think there's this perception of if you're building these tools that make creation easier, and then you get the hobbyist first, and that's, by the way, that's something that's criticism that's been leveled at Heroku. It was like, oh, it's just a hobbyist thing.
And look, if you build something on it and it takes off, you're definitely going to move off, you know, and
right, exactly.
Heroku.
Yeah.
Christina, could you unpack the Jim Clark statement about bundling and unbundling a bit, the philosophy behind it? Because some entrepreneurs listening may be unfamiliar with that, but perhaps could use that framework to help think of new ideas and opportunities.
Yeah. So as my understanding of it, in some ways, fundamentally, I think of it as human needs and desires don't actually change that often, right? But there's different ways to go sort of fill those needs, and new technology can impact that. And then like changes in the market broadly, or distribution, or like how you get your product out to people can change that. And so probably in the Jim Clark era, an example of this would be, right, like, how do you get on the internet? And this was like all kind of brand new. So we were like, okay, you have your dial-up line, you eventually have a telnet thing, and okay, now we have a web browser thing. But it was all these separate pieces, and you had to like figure out, dial in separately, open your web browser, figure out where your web browser is going, do all this stuff. And the people who did it like got this great experience, but it was kind of hard. You had to do 6 things. And then AOL came along and was like, okay, we're just gonna make the 6 things one, right? And you like hit the AOL button, and then some weird sounds happen, and then you're opened onto, AOL homepage where you can go click, news or sports or chat or whatever you want. And so in that sense, kind of AOL like bundled all the things you need to get on the internet into like sort of one button click, and was like quite successful doing that until they weren't. And other folks again came along and split out. Okay, how do you get on the internet? How do you find things? How do you buy things? Whatever. A more recent example, Repl.it is an example of this, or maybe Heroku. And so I think they took the pieces of AWS, right? If you want to, launch your website with AWS, you need to figure out your servers. Maybe you need to figure out your database. If you have like document storage, you have to figure that out. Load balancing, like where does the traffic, how does it go split across your servers? You have to figure all this stuff out. And then the Heroku folks came along and were like, look, that's a lot of decisions. And, if you're a strong developer, you like this, it's kind of fun. But fundamentally, that's pretty constricted. And then there's lots of folks who probably want to get websites in and don't want to think about balancing traffic across different servers and how large are the servers and all this. So we're going to sort of make a button click, deploy your application. So you have your application on your laptop. Now you have it you push a button. Now it's on Heroku. Now it's on the internet. And so they kind of bundled the like 10, 15 things you had to do in AWS into that one button click. And it's, in some ways, a much better user experience, or it's a much better user experience for many use cases. But then you can also imagine there's people who want to go, change some of the dials and knobs. And Heroku literally over time has opened up some of that. But sometimes you want the dials and knobs, you have to go back to the kind of unbundled experience where you have all of the dials and knobs and you can go turn the ones you want to.
Yeah. Alex Danko has this like 4-part mega series on how undescribed just value keeps moving across this, like on different elements of the stack. And it's sort of like, I'm not going to do justice to it, but it's
actually marketplaces are kind of reasonable, right? So if you think about, in some ways, the first wave of, let's say, healthcare marketplaces 10 years ago on the internet, something like care.com, where like a healthcare provider could like write their profile, and then you could go search for them and interview them and call up the ones and then like decide, which healthcare professional you want for your family and pay them and this whole thing. And like it worked. Care.com is to this day a business. But in some ways it was a lot of work. And so then you have things like Honor, where you kind of just go to the website and say, click a button and be like, I would like a, competent elder care professional for my family, and I will pay them this amount. And it just sort of happens. And so there is less customization, kind of specialization in some way, but it's a lot easier to.
Yeah. When did we move to this stage where we wanted all of our companies to be like fully vertically integrated?
I remember when I was like just joining USV, this was 2010, and this was the fat or lean startup, Fred Wilson, Ben Horowitz debate. This was like the week before I joined USV. I was like, oh boy, what am I walking into? Holy wars. But that seemed to be, I think maybe, I don't know, maybe some amount of like in kind of the first internet boom, like everything was almost definitionally like a fat startup, because there was no AWS, like your servers were in your closet and you had to deal with your servers, and whatever you wanted, you had to deal with. And that turned out that was expensive and hard, right? And so many of those companies kind of blew up for one or both of those reasons. And then from that, we kind of learned the what is now the lean startup methodology and like the Erik, Steve Blank kind of world. And that kind of solved a bunch of problems, but again, I think you run into this. You can't control, like as an entrepreneur or product designer, you cannot control the user experience if you're fundamentally giving parts of it away to other companies. And so then you get the seesaw back to, I want to control the pieces. And so that means I have to fundamentally do them. And I think it is more of like a seesaw kind of back and forth, but it does feel like the last few years have been more and more, can technology entrepreneurs kind of full stack different industries so that they can control an experience and create the better experience that they imagine.
At USV, did you guys do any dev tools companies? Any GitHub or Heroku or any of these?
So Albert Wenger was the partner who did most of these, and he invested in Twilio early, Series A. Mongo, with Tengen, I think also A. They've done some things since. Code Climate, for example, where since is post-2012, so I'm quite out of date, but I think Civ Science when I was there.
So that's security?
Machine learning generally, payments fraud is, I think, the primary application.
Talk a little bit about how startups versus incumbents have played within the dev space in the last decade or so.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest, most obvious thing that's happening is that what we talked about with cloud provider being the hardware, and they're leaving so much space for software players. It's amazing. We're going to see more companies, I think, exist in this software layer. They try to catch up, right? It's not like they stand with their, twiddling their thumbs. They actually try to build and compete within that layer. But most of the discovery that's happening between the public clouds and the programmer is happening in the startup layer. So, for example, my friends at Netlify kind of saw early on how static sites are coming back and how the advancements in JavaScript and APIs have created a new way of making applications. So they call it the Jamstack, JavaScript, APIs, and I forgot what's the other one. But basically, it's like you can build an end-to-end application without actually touching any server code. And then now they're marrying that with serverless so that even if you needed that server code, you can put it in a function somewhere and run it on one of the providers or their provider. And so, that sort of exploration is happening in the startup scene. So it's really exciting time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to think through why, at least in my head historically, or in the recent history, call it last 10, 15, 20 years, incumbents have not made that much successful or large developer tooling. And I think some of its software development is, I don't know if it's quite gone from cost center to profit center in most companies. But historically, people didn't make nice things for software developers, right? There weren't very many of them. They didn't have purchasing power. Kind of what market is there to sell to? It's you can sell them a software application to a business problem, but then you're actually talking to the business owner.
That's a very good point. I think CTOs weren't really in that much power for the for the most part, right? Now they're coming into power. Even at traditional companies, CTOs are being sort of listened to, and they're making more of those decisions.
And why is that?
Because they know that software is eating the world. I think they understand that now. And there was this stat that I read recently that software engineering is growing more in non-tech companies than in tech companies. And so what's that part about every company is a software company now? So I think all of that contributed to the idea that, hey, let's actually listen to what our CTO says, what our CTO is playing with on the weekend. And now that created a new market for, what's called B2D, right? Business to developer.
Yeah, I think there have been, startups and large companies that have grown on the backs of selling to development teams, right? Twilio's Ask Your Developer campaign, which is, seems a little silly in San Francisco, but it very much is, there is a bottoms up land and expand go to market for developer tools, selling to being accessible for prototypes in much larger companies. Yeah. Because one team can try something out and look if it works. Right. They might actually be able to buy it, which I think was just not part of anyone's market map or go to market model 15 years ago. To
contrast, if we were going to start a fund that was focused on social networks or even maybe consumer social broadly, today would not be the best time to go do that. Would it be a much better time relative to 5 years ago or 10 years ago to start a fund focusing on dev tools? How would this time in history or looking forward?
It's interesting because to think about these things because, famously, Google started at the worst time to start a search engine. Facebook probably started at the worst time to start a social network. So timing these things is incredibly hard. You might say that there's more options for developer tools now and more people are interested in building them. And maybe that's why starting a fund is good. But if your goal is to find the unicorn, the big player, the black swan by definition is hard to time.
Yeah. So let's pretend for thought experiment that we were starting a fund focusing on dev tools, and we were doing all the standard fun things. We were picking a name, for the name. We were putting our requests for startups on our homepage, telling people what our thesis is. How would we think about what would our approach be in terms of like where we think the emerging unicorns will come in the next few years, and what we think people should be working on or spending more time on?
The way I thought about this and starting Vanta was, if you want to sell to businesses, if you're a B2B company or an enterprise company, you need to solve a business problem. And so what business problems are there that are sort of untouched with software? And again, the kind of security compliance duality is one of the ones we came up, but I think there's lots of those. I think that, or one of the reasons I like that is it dovetails into kind of the rise of a developer within an organization in terms of purchasing power, political power, of whatever, of look, we have this organizational problem and this business need. The development team has to solve it. How can we help them solve that? What else? I mean, I think there's a general strain of frontier tech for developer tools doesn't look as far out there and sci-fi as frontier tech writ large. But kind of to Amjad's point, this is the, like, what are people doing on the weekends? What are the youngest kind of software engineers playing with? What does in fact look like a toy that has no applicable business use case, but in the, 0.5% chance it takes off does in fact change everyone else's workflows from here on out. And so there's kind of a like frontier piece of dev tools. Any thoughts on what that is today? Like what are people doing on the weekends?
It might not be obvious to everyone, but we've seen a lot of activity in the how do you apply machine learning to programming. And that's something that we're playing with at Repl.it. Part of our mission is to like reduce that time to get started, right? Like what's the time to code, right? Some of that is if you're stuck on, at Codecademy, we saw a lot of people drop off because they put a semicolon in the wrong place, right? And so imagine if there is sort of something to give you more intelligent errors.
This is what Kite is trying to do, right?
Kite is trying to do that. There's a project by an intern at OpenAI called Tab9, which is fascinating, to me, much more fascinating than Kite. And there's a new YC company called, I think this batch called Windsor. Yeah, there's quite a bit of activity in this like AI assisted coding space, and I think that's definitely one of the frontiers.
Yeah. Is there anything you would add to either that great thesis or broadly what's going to exist that doesn't exist today? Like, what's a big company that will emerge in the next few years that is not even on people's radar today? Or
people still dismiss our company, Repl.it, as sort of toyish and not very. Why aren't you selling to enterprise yet? That's a question that I get every day. When we were fundraising, everyone was like, yes, you have all these hobbyists and kids using your platform, but where's the enterprise developers? Where's that? And I think the way we're building our platform is very interesting in that it could be really big or it could be nothing. In a sense, it could just remain a toy, or it could become the way people build applications in the future. Mark Andreessen wrote this famous post, or used to be famous, I guess, levels of platforms. So you have like level 1 platform, level 2 platform, level 3. Level 1 is an API, right? Say, Twilio. Maybe Twilio added serverless recently. So, but let's say Twilio like 2 years ago, right? You just hit an API, right? Level 2 is you have an SDK and you also maybe embed the app in your platform, say Facebook games, right? So that was like a level 2 platform. Level 3 platform is SDK, API, and running the user's code inside your platform. So basically you what we said where like the user just has to write the code and they don't have to worry about running the code. They don't have to worry about maintaining the resources. They don't have to worry about anything that goes on there. So we already do this part. Now you can imagine like what happens if we made it so that they can depend on each other's work. They can hit each other's APIs. What if we made it so that there's a social network aspect to it? And we're working on all these different parts right now. Actually, our users are implementing a lot of these features. So the other day I saw a project called Load from Repl. So you're in Repl and you're writing code you can load someone else's code into your application, and you can use any project in the ecosystem as a dependency. So I think what we're building has this like very a potential of being something like totally new and weird and haven't been explored before. So that's what we're aiming for. In terms of like if I were to like kind of place more traditional bets, I definitely very bullish on serverless, and Netlify is really awesome what they're doing. Zeit is pretty cool. And then you have companies like Dev2 is a social network for programmers. And
I just didn't see how that gets to be a venture company, but I'm curious, what's the bullish case on that?
What's the defining feature of GitHub? Is it text storage? It's a social network. So Dev2 is a social network without the text storage part. Right. And not to denigrate GitHub, but ultimately, you're storing text with revisions, right? That's Git.
How do you capture value from that? Or do you just sell to someone bigger?
That's a good point. But the question is like how much optionality they have and which direction to go at some point, right? Yeah. So I think they do have a lot of optionality in terms of like, there's like so many directions to go once you have the user base and once you have the network and network effects and things like that.
Yeah, the thing I would love to invest in is more on the end user computing front. And so fundamentally to me, that's how do you make it easier to let individuals give themselves superpowers, right? And Excel is, again, I think the canonical example here of software that has succeeded in doing that. And so it doesn't have to be, can I write full programs for web apps or iOS applications or whatever? Can be I had to send 17 emails and I wrote myself a way to do that automatically. But I think that's kind of good for two reasons. One, of just this kind of software and writing software is so powerful to opening that up to more people. I think both a moral good and kind of a public good, and then more people will make more interesting things available to more other people. And two, I think actually just funding that, kind of in being explicit about wanting to fund a bunch of software like that will in fact get more software like that created. And so that means like more software that lets individuals kind of tweak it or change it. And again, things like Notion or Airtable are more or less software engineering examples of this. And I don't think it's inevitable that software lets people customize it. Kind of the last 20 years suggest it's not inevitable. And so just being very explicit about like, this is a thing in the world, we would like to see more of it. Please go work on it. We'll support you if you do. I think actually it's a decent chance of just like getting more of it created.
Yeah. If you were to imagine a future where that happens and becomes somewhat of a norm, what would that look like?
Well, I mean, I think like spreadsheets are just kind of the best example here that we have historically, where we have a bunch of people who are able to, again, kind of do things that make their lives easier in one way or another, like sort of write simple software and can get more done. And so again, from a like productivity standpoint or economic growth, or in some ways like individual happiness, like I don't have to count up fewer things, and like I don't have to worry as much if they match because they'll match. Computer will take care of that. Think more like that.
Yeah, I think also like if we sort of democratize like app building, even if it's small apps and things like that, you have this effect where now communities can build their own stuff, right? So for example, right now what's happening is like Silicon Valley creates this application and then we figure out how to globalize it after it works in the US, right? But not everything can be globalized. There are some things that are unique to a certain geographic area, certain culture. And we're seeing that in Uber, actually. The reason Uber did not like grow like Facebook and became like a worldwide thing, there might be a lot of reasons, but my guess is that culture is a big part of it. So for example, where I'm from, Jordan, Kareem just totally sort of destroyed Uber. And the reason it is they understand the culture. They understand the problems there. They understand that people like cash on delivery. They understand that there's certain like codes of respect, between people and the driver. There's certain norms. There's a certain way people act and interact. And I think if we go to a world where people are able to create their own applications, it would make it so it might not be the best for Silicon Valley, but it would be the best for the world, where we're going to see a lot of independent software vendors. We're going to see a lot of economic growth all over the world. Things like what Stripe is doing. with Atlas and the way that they kind of remove the barrier by making payment easier is a big part of that. So a lot of the companies that are really excited about are the companies that are removing the barrier for people to start creating their own things with technology.
Why don't you think any of the make your own Android or iOS application sandboxy companies worked, right? The ones where you're make an application with no code. Because then fundamentally, right, kind of all the high level things seem to line up where you're yes, people want to make applications. Yes, people don't want to go download Xcode or learn Objective-C or whatever, right? And yes, entrepreneurs are making these projects, but none of them really seem to.
I'm not very bullish on no code environments. I think low code environments are a little bit better. And I think even environments that are still code centric, but abstract away a lot of things. So in the mobile space, you have Expo, for example. Expo took technology we built at Facebook, React Native, and just made the entire DevOps experience end to end really, really, really good. And I think they're doing well. But yeah, it's a good question. Why hadn't we seen things like App Inventor and things like that, become something that people all over the world are using?
Yeah, I think it's kind of easy to say, the product's not good enough, or you can't customize it, you can't customize it in the right way, but it does sort of suggest what is the product unlock thing here, or is there not one, and this is just a dead end idea?
That's a good question.
And there was a bunch of people saying, and maybe they're still saying that coding is the new literacy, and everyone will know how to code. Is that overstated, or will that be overstated in your view? And will just be more computing, but without having to know how to code?
Yeah, I like that world much better. There will be more computing where people can make and use software very adroitly. But look, should everyone have to learn what a static classes and pick your language? I hope not. There's just more interesting things to think about, I think.
Yeah, no, I think computing should be on the same level as math or physics in school, right? And then there's the opportunity question. Is that and this is something we're really interested in, is that first of all, are you exposed to that, right? So let's say 12-year-old kid that doesn't have a computer at home, will they eventually be exposed to some kind of programming environment? Because if they are interested and maybe have the talent for it, then they should pursue it, right? So there's the sort of equality of opportunity question there, and I think we should definitely work on that. And then there's the understanding of it. We understand the world around us in terms of physics, in terms of math, in terms of the subjects we learn in school. Then yes, definitely people should understand how computers work, so that, people should understand that, the social media applications are manipulating you to check them more often, right? People should understand that there are programmers behind that and scientists that are trying to get you to do things. And so, yes, people should understand that. People should expose so that if they have the opportunity, they can pursue it. But I don't think we should force people to code. And I don't see a future where, everyone in the world codes. What's the point of that?
We haven't covered super deeply the coding education companies. There's a sort of wave of Code Academy, obviously the first employee there, but Treehouse. There's a bunch of them. What's happened to them? I guess Code Academy is the biggest one.
Yeah, Code Academy is doing really well. They're focused on building the business now. I think we hear less about them because they're less focused on user acquisition,
right?
And more focused on the.
And has that space been more or less fought over? There's not going to be a next wave of.
So MOOCs, have gone through the hype cycle where there was the height of expectation, right? And now they're crashing. So MOOCs always had low retention rates. People put in a lot more hopes in MOOCs than it actually is. I actually believe in that hype cycle model. It's actually very, very predictive. Most of the good work that happens in low hype periods. So for example, crypto, we're probably going to see more crypto applications this year than we saw in 2018, because the real serious people will get down to work or are already working. and they don't have the distractions around them to do that. So I think MOOCs will eventually become more and more of a thing. Different models are propping up, like Lambda School. This is like one of the biggest ones now, where it's really cool, the incentive structures that they built. So it's still a big area, still an area where it could create a lot of economic growth, a lot of opportunity for people. It's like what the best of capitalism could give us in terms of like propping people up, in terms of people kind of, lifting themselves out of poverty and things like that. So this area is really, really important, really cool. The hype is down. And I think ultimately that's a good thing.
Yeah. How do you know when something is in the trough of sorrow right before it's going to rise up versus something that just fails? Clean tech, maybe.
I'm not that familiar with clean tech, but to me, it seems easy to find out. So like you look on Twitter and Hacker News and all the places, and you see what's being claimed, right? And then you go actually install, like you go look at, you get a Bitcoin node or Ethereum node or what have you, and start playing with it. You'll immediately find the delta between the expectation and the thing. So actually, like if you're a VC, I think the most important thing for you to be a practitioner and play around with things on the weekends. Like maybe that's the best way for you to actually understand where are we in the hype cycle. Yeah, I think that's probably it. Like I usually just like go and like take a weekend and go try to build something with something that's like very overly hyped. Like even serverless is as much as I'm bullish on it, and I'd say Repl.it is a serverless IDE. Like the workflow sucks. The ergonomics are not there. The support is not there. But that creates a lot of opportunity. A lot of people should be building tools for serverless right now. But it's obvious that the hype is high.
Cool. Guys, thanks for coming on. This has been a great podcast. Where can people learn more about Vanta and Repl.it, and any plugs or things that people should stay tuned for?
Repl.it is repl.it. My Twitter handle is Masad, AMASAD. I tweet a lot about what all the people are building with Repl.it. So a lot of inspiration there.
It's super fun to follow. Yeah. So Vanta, we're at vanta.com, Vanta. We don't have that much publicly online, but a lot behind the scenes. So if you email us, I'd love to talk.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you for coming on the podcast. If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.